Season 4, Episode 5, To Live is to be Anxious, especially in the toxic workplace. Trajce introduces the idea of psychosocial injury, work-related mental health disorders, and a case in Victoria that led to the regulator's prosecution of the workplace. Alan reminds us that, in this case, the worker committed suicide, and even though this was not found to be directly related to the workplace dynamics, the prosecution fine was significant. Trajce speaks on Brodie's Law. Sarah introduces the idea of the enduring impact of good design. And for further background context, please go back to our Season 1, Episode 5. Warning, a reference is made in this episode to suicide. Hello and welcome to the Why Work podcast series. You are listening to Trajce Vetkovsky, Sarah Pazell and Alan Girl. Recently, when I say recently, only a couple of days ago, the Victorian courts imposed a fine on another Victorian court to the sum of $380,000 relating to a systems failure in terms of psychosocial hazards. So it's one of the handful of prosecutions around psychosocial risk. I mean, I can certainly count on one hand how many of these we've had in Queensland. Traditionally, when we think of a workplace health and safety prosecution, we think of a physical manifestation of an injury, for example, someone who's fallen off a roof, someone who's fallen through a penetration, someone who has lost a finger, and so on and so forth. Physical hazards where there has been a catastrophic physical injury.
It's a really important case. So can you give us a bit more detail on the facts?
Yeah, tell us about it.
Yeah, that case, and we touched on this one briefly in the first season around Kozarov's case.
Yes.
This one involved a coronial decision in relation to a solicitor in Victoria who worked in what could only be described as a toxic workplace where the environment was just toxic.
So vitriol, right.
It was ridiculous workloads, poor workplace cultures, and none of the stuff we talked about before with respect to mentoring or buddying. It was
probably a lot of rites of passage to hoops to jump over.
Yeah, you'd be dealing with some very strong egos in a workplace like that. Anyway, it involved the coronial section of the Victorian court service. The particular worker was clearly under a lot of stress. Time was taken off, not a system in place in order to mitigate, minimise and otherwise reduce the potential for the level of harm in a psychosocial context, clearly, because the defendant had such a significant fine imposed. Anyway, that case came about in the courts, and what the trigger was for that case was the unfortunate
he committed suicide
by her own hand.
Oh, right.
So whilst the case before the courts wasn't about that, there was a coronial there was an inquest in relation to that. After the inquest,
WorkSafe
Victoria commenced an investigation with respect to the workplace environment where this particular person worked, and as a result of that, an investigation commenced.
Yeah.
And here we are now in the courts, fined to the tune of $380,000.
The employer was fined.
To the tune of $380,000. So I mention it because it's one of the very few cases where a psychosocial-based prosecution has been instigated. And I mention it because...
And an award given specifically because
prosecution.
Yes.
And you mentioned this before, Sarah.
Psychological injury
is also an attributing factor to a workplace injury, but that's in the workers' compensation
realm versus a prosecution. Right, I see what you're saying.
And I'm just wondering, do you think the scales will tip and we'll see more psychosocial based prosecutions because of a psychosocial injury? Alan?
I think the case is going to send shockwaves through Australia in numerous different ways. First of all, if a Victorian court service can be prosecuted by a Victorian regulator, that on its own should send shockwaves. So anyone who's employed in the public sector and is concerned about psychosocial aspects within their work environment, here's a case that demonstrates that the public sector is not immune from prosecution, and not just the public sector, but the actual court services. It's quite remarkable.
So from government to government,
From
basically
government
what
to
you're
government,
saying.
yeah. It was an independent statutory body, as I understand it, but even so, it's a body that was involved in the administration of the courts. So,
Yes.
they copped it.
Look, I've even heard about bullying cases in some states' work cover organizations.
We've definitely had bullying cases in Queensland. There's the second thing, and you touched upon this, it's prosecution for a psychosocial offence. And the suicide, as I understand it, wasn't linked to the...
No.
So that sized fine for an offence where you're not connecting the injury to the offence itself is a huge fine. That's a very big fine, and a very big fine for a psychosocial matter. So that should be sending shockwaves through it. Now, if you're a Victorian, you would know that the Victorian government has a whole team of people now who are psychosocial investigators who make it their purpose to go out and investigate psychosocial matters.
Because by way of background, Brodie's decision, a very famous decision called Brodie's Law, involving awful facts surrounding the death of a 19-year-old cafe worker. So Victoria is quite ahead of the curve, which would explain this. But we just say by way of background, this wasn't the first, if you like, significant psychosocial prosecution. They've had a couple of significant ones before that,
So
like
precursors.
Bullying.
So Brodie's Law was based on bullying.
Involving a young...
Horrible bullying.
Yes.
Who ended up taking her own life. And Brodie's Law, and there's an amazing educative video on YouTube simply called Brodie's Law. I always get my students to watch it when we do the undergraduate version of workplace behaviour lecture. So Victoria, so I'm not surprised by the size of the fine because it is Victoria.
But I think if you're running a Victorian business, you would be more concerned than you were elsewhere in Australia about psychosocial matters. But you should be concerned no matter where you are in Australia, of course. And the other thing that comes out of this case, which is obvious on reflection, is if you don't have a system in place for managing psychosocial issues, if you've got nothing. So the inspectors come out and they say, what have you got to manage psychosocial issues? And your answer is, well, nothing really. You're in trouble. And potentially in very big trouble.
That's what this case was about, really. It wasn't about there was no circumstance of aggravation. It certainly came about as a result of what was exposed in the inquest about the lack of systems in place.
Let's just talk a bit about bullying, because it's a very complicated aspect when you talk about the psychosocial harm in a workplace and finding that causation. And you're talking about some pretty strong cases, because you've got to unpack, what is somebody's mental health state almost? What is their propensity, their anxiety levels? What is their existing pre-morbid condition? And is it exacerbating something where you have a mental health condition? Or is it completely causing some harm as well, right? So there's a lot to unpack in that. And when you think about workplace bullying, it's repeated behaviors, right? And it's unreasonable and repeated behaviors directed towards somebody where there's a power imbalance and where it could create harm.
That's when you're looking at employment law, but under work health and safety law, some of the inspectors adopt the approach of it has to be repeated behaviour, but it doesn't have to be repeated behaviour.
Good to clarify that. Okay, tell us about that, Alan.
So you could just have a one-off event
that was just egregious.
That could lead to a work health and safety prosecution.
Right.
Even though under employment law it might not be considered bullying because it's not repeated behaviour.
Yes.
So I think the big thing for employers though is, firstly, you should be designing the workplace so that these issues don't come up in the first place.
Yeah.
But if the issues do come up, you have to have a system in place, and it has to be a system that you'll feel comfortable with it being scrutinised, because that's exactly what happens. So I've been in these investigations with WorkSafe Victoria, And where it becomes very difficult is where they get to the point, they've got a script that they follow, and eventually they get to the point where they say, tell us about some of the incidents you've had and how you've managed those incidents. And they might say, tell us about the sexual harassment cases you've had and how you've managed them. Now, nothing you tell the government is confidential. Everything's open. And of course, you don't want to be telling the government about very personal matters for both parties. And it immediately becomes very uncomfortable. And from a employer perspective, well, you're worried the situation's going to be inflamed. You might have managed to deal with it, however was the way you dealt with it, and then you're worried it's going to become inflamed by the inspectors digging around it.
Unpack it again, right? And then the work travel where sex happened, like we talked about in season 1, okay?
Yeah, and then it's very uncomfortable to talk about. You don't want to talk about it. And that's what's happening. The inspectors are coming out and they're probing about it. Now, what they want to know is that the complaint was properly investigated and properly attended to. And with this court case, there was no system in place, as I understand it. And that's why they got smashed.
But one of the things I ask employers to think about is who is vulnerable in your workplace and why? Because I've mentioned this before. I'm going to say it again. Too often I see that there are distinct, separate programs to manage physical risks, manual tasks, musculoskeletal disorders, and a separate program to manage psychosocial health hazards. And the two don't join. And we forgot to think about humans and performance and who's most vulnerable in our workplace, either, by the nature of that workforce, the precariat workforce, for example, or a workforce that has a low level of education and, some disparity there in power. Or is it because they work in a system of work where vulnerabilities could arise because there are some known fatal hazards in that system of work, like in a mine and in construction? And who's vulnerable in your workplace?
Well, I'd prefer to think of it. I think everyone's vulnerable in the workplace.
But you can't do everything all at once, is what I'm getting at. So you've got to have some pointed, design strategy somewhere.
Yeah, you do have to have design strategy.
Yeah, but you know what was ironic was you set the separate way up the twain meeting. But you know what the irony in all this is? As I mentioned earlier, currently there is a primary and a secondary or an additional psychological injury attached to the musculoskeletal injury. And they've converged.
Of course, at what point did we not understand that our mind and our body was integral? And this is, I just ran a webinar sponsored by the Office of Industrial Relations, Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. They asked me to talk about manual task risks, and I thought, okay, I have done these types of lectures, the most conventional ones, for so many years. I kind of came back and said, can I do this from a work design lens? Can you let me take it just another step further, right? So we talked about the 3 M's, manageable, meaningful, manual tasks from a work design lens. And I asked the participants, the delegates, we had about 700 people sign into this webinar. And I asked them, please, on a little poll, do you have separate programs for manual tasks, for psychosocial harm? And if so, I ask questions like, is one managed better than the other? Or do you have like a really robust system where it's deeply embedded on understanding humans and performance? And I think the percentage was something like 6% had a very robust, integrated method of managing and identifying vulnerable workers and understanding combined human performance programs, right? Most said, yeah, we have one program or the other. Most said one is really not working that well. And most said, no, they didn't really have a system to identify who's vulnerable in their workplace, right? So these were the questions I asked, because to me, at what point in all of our theories, we understand that our physical selves are related to our psychosocial well-being, and the cognitive demands of our work and the emotional demands of our work can affect also our physical being. So why are we having separate programs? Now, I know it's part of the answer already. I can predict this. We've done a lot of work to have separate guidance documents and codes of practice about physical risks and about psychosocial risks. And so people think I need a physical program and I need a psychosocial program. In fact, you just need a human performance program, full stop. And you can draw from this valuable information. There's some great information in all the codes of practice and the ISO standards. And then synthesize this in a really deliberate way to understand every task that I do has a physical component, a tactic, a cognitive component of thinking and planning, and an emotional component of how I feel and how I relate to others in an environmental system. Boom, right? So your programming is around people and performance and identifying who's vulnerable in the workplace. Again, by the nature of the cohort or by the system of work. What's going to make someone more vulnerable than others? And it could be also, you're talking about anybody could be vulnerable. I'm going to put out this phrase for you guys. This is something I've been ruminating on, and I tend to do this a little bit. I do my work, as you were talking about, Trajce, and then I have my compulsions. And these are like problems I need to solve that whir around in my brain. If I said to you, to live is to be anxious, what would you say to that?
To live is to be anxious.
I live. I exist. Therefore, I am anxious.
I think you signed me up. I think I get a stick. I'm going
to call wife number 2 and find out.
I don't have a wife number 2. The thing is, just for those who can't see, what am I wearing, Alan?
A wonderful T-shirt. Wonderful. Come on, you talk us through it.
It's my Franz Kafka T-shirt. So to live is to be anxious. I'm actually wearing a T-shirt that says that. It's Franz Kafka.
Is that what that means? I didn't even know that.
Franz Kafka is. We could do another podcast on Franz Kafka. That's
okay.
Sartre is my side hobby. Foucault is my side hobby.
Yes.
No, I'm Franz Kafka's number 1 fan. Which we'll talk about another time.
This has been because I think
the trial. Read the trial for those of you who know what I'm talking about, or the castle. All right.
I'm going back to what we spoke about earlier about
So why did you say this? To live is to be anxious.
To live is to be anxious. Okay, so let me explain this because I'm going back to even think about the way we have rites of passage, the way we test people, the way there's hazing in the workplace, the way we educate healthcare workers. Are we pushing them to the point of failure to see if they can cry? Are we setting up nurturing ways? If we said that statement, to live is to be anxious, pause. We might actually have a little more empathy before we start to design things, right? Hang on. If everybody, as you said, well, anyone could be vulnerable. So if everybody could, or anyone could be vulnerable in a workplace, doesn't it just make you pause and reflect and think, how do I do this with a little more sensitivity? Even in basic education, right? The other part that I've been studying with this communication, human information processing, human factors model is about how we tell stories, right?
But before you move off the anxious stuff, I did notice
I'm not moving off anxious.
You mentioned Trajce's wife number 2. And I
don't have a wife number 2.
She treats him very well, much better than wife number 1. So he's not anxious at all.
She gets foot massages every night.
Yeah,
she should. It goes both ways.
There's absolutely zero
all
anxiety.
The anxiety is dissolving in Trajce's home with foot massages every night of the week. Yeah. I'm telling you right now.
That's what he learned in the changeover from wife 1 to wife 2.
That was this. He's only been married once, folks. Again, for the record. We just tease him.
Listen to this podcast anyway, so it won't matter.
So
hold on a second. So the reason
back to anxiety.
The reason why I say everyone is vulnerable in the workplace, because I often see things from the employer's perspective, not so much from the employee's perspective. Yep. And I frequently see bullying allegations against mid-level managers.
Yes.
And those mid-level managers are often very stressed because they've got big demands on them and they don't have the coping skills to cope.
Bingo.
And their behaviour becomes inappropriate behaviour because they're so stressed. And then, of course, when they're accused of being engaged in bullying behaviour, the stress levels just go right through the roof. And then they're enormously distressed and very anxious.
Yes.
And in a sense, they become a victim of the whole overall process.
There can be upward bullying, if you will. There can be bullying to managers from groups of employees too.
But it can just be the system that causes
it. It can be the system. And that's, again, why I say, imagine to live is to be anxious. And suddenly we might pause and think, wow, how do we be a little more sensitive? How do we have some empathy with the way that we do things? Now,
so when Trajce was prosecuting and he would drag people through the courts,
Trajce, big bad Trajce. The big bad wolf is sitting here.
They were very anxious.
And he's got a T-shirt talking about anxiety, and he's the big bad wolf.
No, he is.
Your ears, your pointy ears, right?
That's me.
We'd be saying, who's your prosecutor? Oh, Trajce.
Oh, no, not Trajce. No, not the T. Not the T. T-Rex.
Just give up now. Just give up.
That's it. Oh, no.
Leave the country. That's the best thing to do.
That's it.
In those learning examples, in those learning examples, I'm trying to talk about how do you translate really complex information and make them into nice, colorful picture, video-based storyboards or immersive realities? How do you do bite-sized, manageable information to make sure you get the right information to the right people and they can respond in the way that you hope or expect for the system to work well, right? So even going back to that healthcare education, is there another way to do things where you can have bite-sized, knowledgeable, well-informed education where people can interact and engage and then test them as they go without having this big, horrible test at the end where they just crumble and want to die? Equally in the workplace, if everybody was considered to have some level of anxiety, right? That's when you talk about that Dodgson's-Yerkes curve, right? That Yerkes-Dodgson's curve about performance, the Goldilocks just right degree of challenge. We're all a little bit anxious. And is it the just right degree of anxious? Is it to the point where I am challenged to solve a problem that really excites me, that inspires me, that motivates me, right? And if I have anxiety equally, are you dampening my interest in life because it's too damn sullen and boring? And so if everybody has some level of anxiety, whether it's public speaking, a manager, as you said, a middle manager, you might think should be exposed, but they might be really nervous about presenting their meeting.
So you're saying that.
Sarah, I was going to say something else. I was going to say, Sarah, so I get the impression that you're probably not the biggest fan of a 56-page code of practice around psychosocial hazards.
I think it's a useful library as a resource for those who have the skills to review it, right? And it's a useful library, but I don't think if you have a separate program about psychosocial risks, for example, as I have mentioned, I have an employer now who has come to me and said, I've had an outside hired consultant who's looked at our psychosocial risks. I've had another outside hired consultant who's looked at our manual task risks. We've got these two big reports. What do we do with them now?
Yeah, so people don't go to libraries.
They don't know what to do with this because, like the psychosocial ones in particular, they're not anchored in a review of performance tasks. They're anchored in the really nebulous statements. And in this department, someone said this, and in this department, someone said this, and they go through the code of practice and they list all the potential hazards, which are not risks. Hazards need to interact and to be in the right circumstance. They need to be contextualized to have meaning. And they simply do a green, yellow, orange, red safety scale, which is almost meaningless without the context.
I mean, you use the word library, so not everyone goes to the library.
Not everyone goes to the library, but these are resources that are useful library resources, if you will, that are freely available, the codes of practice, right? And you can use them to synthesize, all right, who's in our workforce? What tasks are they doing? What are their systems of work and what are their environments of work? And how do we identify who needs support and escalate that based on a people and performance combined task-based performance analysis?
Chunks are the better way to go, bite-sized
and the most meaningful, pertinent systems. Otherwise it's too dilute. So and in this case, like this current client asking me, what do I do with this information? I read the reports. I'm like, no wonder you're asking me. Right. It's just all over the place.
So the key is
not anchored.
You bespoke, you target,
contextualize.
You contextualize, but you pinpoint that specific issue or issues, whether they're interrelated or not.
Everywhere. And notice, and if you identify hazards, so what? Hazards exist everywhere. That's why I go back to saying to live is to be anxious. And if somebody comes back and says, ooh, we hear reports of anxiety in your organization, contextualize to what? To live is to be anxious.
Yeah, so that,
is it meaningful or not, right?
So in itself, saying that's just not enough.
That's nothing.
It's nothing.
It's nothing.
You need to go beyond the veil of anxiety. You need to pierce that veil. And,
Well, does that mean that if you're not anxious, you're not living?
You're a little too mellow,
this is getting into Descartes', eat, therefore I am.
Therefore I am. Yeah. I'm anxious, therefore I am.
I eat, therefore I am.
No, I'm anxious, therefore I live.
Therefore I live. Yes. That's right.
This is getting quite philosophical.
So
That's your foray.
So those
Yes, I'm
types of
interested.
reports that you were describing
Yes.
are very generalised, and they're really just a regurgitation of the codes of practice.
Exactly. And they just find a few examples, but it's expensive. They're paying expensive consultancy fees for these type of reports that almost tell you nothing about a true meaningful action plan.
I can tell you they're not much help when the inspectors come out, because
Thank you.
the inspectors will say, give us some examples of where you've identified hazards and risks and how you manage them.
Well,
So
actually,
they want the context, right?
They want it tied down to actual things.
before that, they'd say, "Can you show me your register?"
They will. But you can get registers thrown together that are similarly meaningless.
Yeah.
Except what I've seen the risk registers. No mention of psychosocial risk. Just
Oh, they're very physical dominated.
Yeah, so that's your first do not pass go. At least have a register in place.
So in this webinar, for example, I took a task that is so familiar to pretty much everybody. It's about doing laundry, right? We should all recognize what doing laundry is because we do it at home. So I decided to choose a task.
Not money laundry.
What?
Not
Not
money
money laundering, although I could talk about some stories in that vein too. But anyway, back to clothing laundry, right?
All right, linen, etc.
Linen laundry,
Okay.
right? And
Laundered socks, not
yeah,
laundered.
socks, shirts, jocks, all the rest of it.
Yes,
okay.
sure.
Because I wanted the 700 people that were signed up to do this webinar just to have a task that they could all relate to.
Was it sponsored by Omo? Sorry.
That's free advertising here.
Yes, you're not meant
Let's
to
see
do
if we
that.
get sponsorship now.
Yeah, I know if you're listening. We're clean. All right.
Smell fresh too.
All right, now please.
So,
Sorry, I digress.
So
It's
laundry, right? So we're talking about laundry, and that way people can understand, all right, we can start to already think, it's a safe place to start thinking about what the physical requirements are. The fact you might have to pull out from a deep industrial washing machine tangled laundry, right? And that's difficult and hard, whatever. Even from your home laundry, sometimes things are tangled and annoying to get out. And then you might think about, well, I have to lift my shoulders, and if I'm doing this task, not just for 20 minutes like we do at home, but for 8 hours, my shoulders are sore and I'm folding this laundry. But then you start to think about that same task with physical demands also has demands like in the environment. Maybe you have poor ventilation. You've got this hot machinery, and with the heat thermal response from all the machinery operating, you have chemicals that you're exposed to all the time, right? You may have biohazards if you're working in healthcare and you're cleaning up soiled laundry, and you have to be careful about biohazards, right? You've got and blood and guts and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
Let alone, fecal matter, et cetera, right? So you've got biohazard management. And then you may have things like electrical power safety, and you may be challenged because there's not enough power cords in the environment that you're working in. And then you may have isolation. You're the forgotten Mohicans that are in the back doing the laundry, like you're in the basement, right?
Yes.
So, or you're in the side corner. Nobody's thinking about you. Nobody's stopping in to just chat. There's not like the water cooler chat in the back laundry.
Do
Okay.
people forget that you do the laundry?
Who does the laundry at home, Trajce?
Renee.
Really?
No wonder you're not anxious. You should be anxious about that.
Yeah, he's giving foot massages in
I was
exchange.
just thinking of just how nice and nice and crisp the clothes are. When I do them, it's soft and fluffy. Renee does them. I do it as well, and she's
I
away
just saw a
working.
hack this morning on a side note. I saw a hack. It says if your t-shirt comes out crumpled, right, and you want to put this t-shirt on, seriously, I don't know this. You throw it in the dryer with an ice cube for 5 minutes, and it comes out ironed. I'm like, what?
Yeah, but that's
I'm going to try this. I'm going to crumple one up on purpose and see if that
Except
works.
that's an ice cube I could put in my gin. But anyway, I digress.
The gin ice cube. Okay.
So you're drinking gin and tonic while Renee's doing your washing.
No, I will be
not
when
a
I
good
go
look.
on the
When
at the
she hears
conference.
this, you should be anxious.
Yes, very anxious.
All right.
Let's
So
get back to
now,
this because
and then
I want to stop there and
But
say,
where's the risk of psychological
I just
injury? in your exam?
said, so you're isolated, right?
Oh,
you
true,
may not,
true.
you may not have much autonomy.
Yeah.
You may not have
we got bullying.
job control, right? How much is somebody just telling you to do the job this way? Or do you have a question mark? I'm just putting this as a question mark. Do you have autonomy and control about the work volume? You might not feel as though any of your ideas to improve the system are ever heard. Is there a mechanism for you to voice that and to be engaged in the design of your work?
So, Sarah, just tell me, are you saying all the other factors that you've just mentioned, but for the psychosocial, are you saying all of those have been considered or they haven't?
I'm saying point to do a manual task risk assessment program without also at the same time, any task-based program could be just human performance-based. Use that opportunity while you have consultants or you internally resources are allocated to examine a task and go for gold. Look at physical, look at environmental, look at the psychosocial hazards, the cognitive demands. Do a proper, thorough analysis and get outside hired experts for those aspects that you need support on and analyze why somebody would be vulnerable in that task and understand who's that cohort. And the other part of that vulnerability is the cohort. These are you look at job labor market stats just in Australia, freely available, right? These are usually people who have a lower wage than the rest of Australia, precariat workforce that are usually not full-time, very hard to secure full-time work. So they're casualized workers, gig economy workers. They may be low levels of education.
Most of Australia at the moment.
Low levels of education, mostly women, right? So now you're looking at a vulnerable cohort. And then you continue to unpack this and understand, what else are we doing in the work system that exacerbates the vulnerability of these people having to do this job?
Yeah.
How are we really creating harm or how are we constructing health for a population who is already marginalized before they start their jobs?
Well, I'll call those junk jobs because of the lack of security and
lack of security.
The great unwashed, no pun intended.
And so do they really feel so let's say you run the perfect manual task hazard education program.
Yeah.
Are those people who are already marginalized and fearful of losing work going to report a hazard, or are they afraid of losing their job? Now, you can't, and that's where I say it has to be contextualized. I think you mentioned this earlier, Alan. You can't run the same old education program for a marginalized population versus somebody who's confident to report a hazard.
Well,
right?
let's
different context.
Let's keep it clean. Let's get back to the laundry. Now, go back to the laundry.
Was that
and back to your model.
ad again? All right.
Let's get back to the laundry. So just let me get this straight. In your experience?
In my experience? In my research and in my studies there, Trajce.
In your whole
highly specialized research and studies.
In your whole of work life experience. And let's stick to the laundry. Please tell me this, that all the other elements you just described, i.e. the actual tasks and the manual component, the environmental aspect, the hygiene component, the electrical component, the slips, trips and falls, if you plug that thing, have at least those factors have been integrated but for the psychosocial, or are you saying
most of the time, no. Most of the time, no. Not even those anchors. And the other part I'm trying to prompt businesses to think about is then once you have that data, first drill deep. Yeah. And once you have that data, start using design strategies like create a persona, which means you study the work cohort, create some empathy maps and understand the realities of their work and the varieties of work, like what we talked about. Work is done, work is disclosed, work is prescribed, work is imagined. And then from that, go through journey maps about what their experience is. So use some real basic, fundamental, conventional design tools and human factors expertise. And then go through my interventions need to be the stuff that's the most resilient and enduring. Things like if I had a great environment with plenty of space and the right reaches and good ventilation and good airflow and good light, etc., am I already mitigating workarounds for the next 20 years because I'm starting with something that can impact you significantly? Or if I have a really shitty environment, am I creating harm for the next 20 or 30 years that these people are working? And then you go through, what about the equipment that I buy and purchase? Spend a little bit more money, get the best stuff. And again, you're now talking about years of intervention. And then you go through the job design and you go through those things that are most enduring. And don't just go, I know, we'll do behavioral training about manual handling and think about lift procedures.
Alan, Sarah, guess what she just used before the word?
What?
She used the word journey.
A journey map.
Still use the word journey.
That's a tool in design strategy. You talk about journey maps. I'm not all like, hey, dude, what's your journey? Okay. It's actually called a journey map. That's what it is.
Can we work on another word? Like a destination platform?
Destination platform.
I think I prefer destination platform. I'm just for the
sensitive
listeners.
to that. Yeah. Tell me about your journey, man.
Yeah, for the listeners out there, we suffer from journey fatigue. We've been traveling a long journey because a lot of people talk about journeys, and I just want to redesign the nomenclature. I prefer destination platform.
Destination platform.
You've been listening to Trajce, Sarah and Alan, and if you really enjoyed this show, share this with a friend. Submit your 5-star rating on your favourite podcast streaming service. Keep listening and send in your stories. You can email us at hello@ywork.com.au, and of course sign in to our newsletter. You can head straight to our website at www.ywork.com.au. We can't wait to learn about the trouble you've seen in the workplace. And remember, none of the things we've talked about today should be construed as legal advice or any other type of advice. We're just here to talk about all things related to work, and we hope you enjoyed as much as we do. We love it. See you next time.